Good afternoon, everybody. Beautiful day in Maine. For those of you who haven't met me before, I am Joe Kurlanski. I'm the president of Monarch. And I reached out to John yesterday and I said, I don't know if you've been getting any questions about the rule, the CMMC rule coming out. Is there anything you want me to talk about? And John quickly said he's been getting a couple questions. And would I mind doing just a quick webinar update to everybody and see what's going on here? Monarch is a certified third-party assessing organization, the only one in Maine, and one of only three now in the Northeast, but we'll talk about that later. I do want to keep this pretty short and be respectful of everybody's time, so we're just going to talk about the rule making status and just a little updates. If that's all you want to hear, you're in good shape. We'll talk a little bit about what you can still do if you're trying to figure out what's going on. We're going to talk about the different phases and what's happening. So the first thing you need to know about, I just did this kind of quick summary. My new favorite thing is too long, didn't read. So what is going on in the new rule that dropped? The new CMMC rule came out last week. So we have a functioning CMMC program as of December 16th, which means I can start doing assessments on December 16th. We are still waiting for the second rule. I'll talk more about that, the CFR 48, and the effective date on that is still what's going to trigger when we will start to see CMMC requirements in contracts. We expect phase one still to begin sometime in spring, early next year, early spring, late winter. March is still the date we're hearing where phase one of CMMC will launch, where most people with new contracts, if the CMMC requirement is in it, require a self-assessment for phase one and phase two. And everyone's been focusing on self-assessments, and I just want to remind everybody they need to be a passing self-assessment. So that means a score of 88 or better with a POAM. So don't throw that negative 65 or 32 up in spurs and think you're good. There will be some limited number of contracts coming out in phase one that are going to require a C3PAO assessment. The other thing that came out on the rule is level 3 is now fully defined. So we don't have to worry about level 3 until phase 2, but I wanted to put that out there. We're going to talk about that too when we get there. What happened? We still have our basic 3 levels of maturity. Maturity level 1, CMMC, anybody with federal contract information. It's fully fleshed out. It is the 15 requirements and the 17 practices I'm putting in parentheses because it's the 15 requirements that were way back, always in the FAR clause. They've been there for a long time. In CMMC, they broke them up into 17 practices. The physical security, they took one requirement, broke into 3 parts. That's the confusion there. These are, as I've always been telling you guys, these are things every one of you who've got a computer connected to the internet should be doing anyway. And you will always be self-attest for this. If you just have maturity level 1 in your contract, it's going to be a self-assessment. You're going to put it in spurs, and you need to meet all requirements. There's no POAM. It's an all or none situation. For level 2, similar to what we've known before, they are sticking with NIST 800-171 R2. This has been the requirement all along. For those who remember, 800-171 Rev 3 came out. They are choosing to ignore that for now. As I mentioned, it's going to be self-assessment for most contracts in phase 1, which is going to be a year long. They have identified there will be some people with a lower acuity of CUI, something that's less important, that will always just have a self-assessment requirement. We just expect that to shrink over time. And they're basically doing this as a buffer so that the CMMC ecosystem and the number of C3PAOs and assessors can grow to match the demand. This is what we know about maturity level 3. So CMMC level 3 is 24 practices have been identified, but not all of them necessarily will be required. So the contract will say, hey, you're going to have CMMC level 3. Here are the, let's call it 10 practices out of maturity level 3 that are going to be required. You will first have to do a level 2 certification by a C3PAO and have a full 110, no POAM, everything's done, assessment completed by a C3PAO. And then we're going to pass you on to DIBCAC, who will assess the final 10 practices that are required by the contract. We know they'll spot check the initial level 2 assessment, just check on some things, make sure your C3PAO knew what they were doing. And the POAM is possible with level 3 as well. As I mentioned, plan of action and milestones are back. They are definitely there. For those who remember, CMMC initially was going to be no POAM ever. It was always a 110 or bust. You were done, you were starting over. What they have done is say no POAM for level 1. The POAM rules for level 2 are, I think, as I described them back in September, which is you need to have an 88 out of 110 points. So if you remember, you get 110 points to start. That's a perfect score. And you subtract either 5 points, 3 points, or 1 point, depending on the practice, and your point level drops. So as long as you don't drop beneath 80% of the total score, which is 88 points, I don't know why they said 80%, but that's what they did. And as long as none of the practices that are not met are over a 1 point value. So you can't have any of the big 5 pointers in there when you're not meeting a requirement. So you couldn't have a non-encrypted VPN, or your wireless isn't encrypted. It'd be a bad thing. There is one FIPS exception in there for you would be -3 instead of 5. And that's so if you had a wireless network and it wasn't using a FIPS validated encryption module, you would only subtract 3 points instead of the normal 5. The problem is the language was left in the other practices around wireless, around VPN, where if you don't have FIPS approved validated software in those, it's still a -5 points. So they may fix that and do something with that later. But I know right now I don't think that's written as it was intended. So just assume nothing over a 1 pointer. You have 180 days to fix whatever was not met, and then the C3PA would come back. POAM also permitted for level 3. Here, the 80% makes more sense, where they will gauge, okay, you have 10 requirements that were in your contract at level 3. Each requirement's worth 1 point. So as long as you have 8 of them complete as met, you could POAM the other 2. Again, you have 180 days to go back to DIBCAC, say we fix these other 2 things. What are we watching today? First, we know the CMMC program 32 CFR is in the Federal Register. The effective date, as I mentioned, December 16th, codifies everything about the program, the requirements, the assessors, the C3PAOs, the Cyber EB, the training, everything is in there. It's a long, fun read if you like it, but it basically outlines the entire program, allowing people to get CMMC certifications. We're not going to actually be able to call them certifications. It's going to be a certificate of status with something like that. We're trying to figure out the language on that. It's something to do with ISO. It's language. It's fine. We'll figure it out. The second rule we're watching, as I mentioned before, is the 48 CFR. This is the effective date we really want to be watching, because this is when they will start dropping it in contracts. We still expect this to come out before the election. As soon as we have that date, I'll let John know, and I'll let everybody know what our new phase 1 date is, so everyone is on board with that. Those contracts, it'll be up to the PMO. What's a level 1 self-assessment? What's a level 2 self-assessment? What's a level 2 requiring a C3PAO? What's a level 3 assessment? So we know those are on their way. There's 2 other little rules out there. Those are already going. They don't affect the program much, but they do have broader implications in terms of CMMC applying beyond the DoD. We do know there are other federal agencies very interested in this, so that's what we're keeping an eye on as well. Phase 1, at its discretion, DoD may require a level 1 or level 2 self-assessment to exercise an option or extension. Not all contracts that gave themselves a maybe in the rule of whether all contracts in phase 1 coming out will have a level 1 or level 2 self-assessment, but we expect there will be level, and we know there's also going to be ones requiring certification, and that's the piece I highlighted for you. And this was something I highlighted back in September. It still holds true. The only thing that changed was they threw in the self-assessment requirement also being in there. Contractors may be given a 6-month lead to get assessed, so those contracts hit in March, and we want to make sure we know that. Everybody needs to be ready. Okay. Phase 2. This was another change. So in September, when I spoke with you all, phase 2 is going to begin 6 months later. Phase 2 now begins 12 months later. So everything's spaced out a year at a time. So March 2026, we expect to see more level 2 certification requirements requiring a C3PAO certification. We may have a grace period to allow companies as well. Further, we start to see level 3 start popping out for some specific contract awards. Phase 3, 2 years from next, March 2027, We're fully implemented with level 2 for almost all contract awards, unless they're way down the line in CUI. Level 3 is starting to really kick into gear. There may be a grace period, but we're going to start asking people who are up for renewal and options to start doing their certifications too. CMMC Day 3 years from now, March 2028, fully rolled out. Everything's going to be implemented. And of course, we see people starting to roll around who were in there the first time. So that's the summary of what's in the rule. The lessons we've learned so far, people who are going down this path, still about a 9 to 18 month journey, depending on where you are. And it also depends on leadership buy-in, who you have on staff, what your MSPs are like. And most of your customers can get 90% of the way in about a year, most of our customers. We always suggest doing a readiness assessment. Oh, one thing I did not highlight in here, and maybe the next slide's a good one to talk about this. When we get into strategies below, one big change that everybody was confused about, we knew this was the reality in the draft, but they're very clear about managed service providers now. Initially, managed service providers, as written, looked like they were going to have to be assessed. They do not. We're recommending they don't get assessed unless they meet a certain threshold of DIB clients. So if you're working with a managed service provider who's helping manage your network, they should just expect to be there when you're getting assessed. We're going to have questions for them about their change management. We're going to ask them about their training. What we would not expect to do is have to go to their facility and do a full CMMC certification assessment of them. The only time it makes sense is when you have an MSP who has probably more than 10 clients in the DIB, where they're not going to be able to scale to show up at everybody's assessment to answer questions. Then it may make sense for them, or they're actually storing your CUI for you. That's another issue. And if you have any cloud service provider, Microsoft Azure, Amazon, they have to be FedNAMP moderator, higher authorized. They have to have an ATO. So that's part of that outsourcing. CMMC certification is a heavy lift, but it's not all new technology. Please don't fall for the shiny thing out there. We were railing against people who are selling tools and software products and saying, this is all you need for CMMC. It doesn't exist. So please, it take a lot of time and effort, and we don't want people wasting money out there when they don't have to. It can result in significant changes to your operation, but more it's about embedding cybersecurity into your day-to-day operations and just getting people thinking about cybersecurity, making sure somebody's keeping an eye on those updates and viruses and reports. And before you onboard a new product, somebody's thinking, hey, does this affect our cybersecurity compliance status, our CMMC status? Strategies are about outsourcing. I mentioned using a cloud service provider, working with Microsoft or Amazon. Google has a solution as well. There's some other next tier down providers such as Prevail you may have heard of. They are also a good solution. You definitely want to get a listing of the controls that are shared. They call it a shared responsibility matrix. What are they responsible for? What are you responsible for? Biggest strategies we are working with people on today is scope reduction. This means reducing the amount of people and locations where the CUI is actually being stored. This is actually an exercise we've gone through with a few people where we've said, hey, this keeps creeping. Let's go back to your contracts. Which contracts actually say you have the DFARS clauses in it, say they're giving you CUI. Hopefully they're marking the CUI. I know that's a whole nother discussion, but who's getting it? Where are they putting it? And can we limit who's accessing them? Once we have those conversations, we can start locking things down. Hey, turns out only one person is going and fetching this data from EB or whatever. They're sticking it in one folder. There's only 3 people in this company needing access to. That's our scope. Those are the people that are in scope. Those are the assets in scope, those laptops, those endpoints, that server that it's got it stored on. Let's get this tight as possible and put everybody out of scope as we possibly can. We've used this to limit access to like wireless. Hey, it's these 3 people are getting the CUI. We can't get FIPS approved wireless in time, or it's going to cost us an arm and a leg. You know what? We're going to wire those 3 people. We're going to run out the old Cat6 cable and we're going to hardwire everybody. Problem solved. We're on our way. Finally, the other big thing to think about is see if you can implement policy instead of doing a technical implementation. My favorite one around this is around USB drives. Instead of having to technically prohibit the use of USB drives, you need a policy to control them. That's the rule. Control your removable media. That means you know who has it and where it is. And the policy may say, hey, we have to use USB drives or movable media to get the instructions back to the machine shop. It's got to come from this system. So there's 5 USB drives that are approved. They all belong to John. John's got them in a file cabinet somewhere. They're locked up. And when you need one, you go talk to John. You're not allowed to pick one up off the street. You're not allowed to buy your own. And as long as that's in your policy, it's somewhere in an acceptable use agreement. And then when I go talk to Fred back in the machine shop, I say, hey, Fred, can you just go buy a USB drive or pick one up in the parking lot? And he go, oh, no, I got to go talk to John. John's got the special drives, and then I got to bring them back to him. You're good. You are controlling your removable media. That's where it is. Do I want you to have a tool that blocks removable media that isn't permitted? Absolutely. Do you need it for CMMC compliance? No, you actually do not. I said this in September, but please budget for your assessments now. I will say, expect those budget numbers are going to have to creep up a little. One of the things that happened during the rulemaking that was a little surprise to us was rather than requiring one certified or CMMC certified assessor on each assessment, they are now requiring 2. That just doubled just our material costs right off the bat. I was hoping it could just be me and a lackey taking notes, so to speak. And then I had to come back and I had to have a QA on staff to actually review the assessment. And that was what I needed. Now everybody needs to have 2 CCAs at every assessment. They also upped the requirements of those CCAs and lead CCAs because frankly, some of the assessors out there weren't very good. The DIBCAC saw what was going on, saw there were people just coming off the street and only been doing this for a couple of years, had never been in cybersecurity and never done an audit or an assessment before, and that was no good. We are still fortunate enough that we have 5 CMMC assessors on staff, so we are doing pretty well on that. We expect a lot of people to be using contractors. That brings its own set of potential issues. So we're really grateful we have people on staff. I always say, remember that this is an assessment, not an audit. If you start talking to people and they keep saying audit, start backing off a little bit on that. It's always about a process. What are you doing? You've probably heard me use this example before. In an audit, I'm going to ask for your last 20 new hires. I'm going to randomly pick 5 people and ask for their background checks and their training documentation, signed acceptable use agreements. In an assessment, tell me what you're doing. Show me an example. Where are you tracking that? Even if I run across somebody where we can't find the signed acceptable use agreement, that's an operational issue. We have the policies, we have the plans, we see here's a few, 3, 4, 5 other people we've done it for. We just picked the wrong person. That should not be failing you. You have a process in place, you're following it. That's what this assessment should be about. Clear scoping and inventory is a big thing. What's in scope? What is out of scope? What do you have for CUI assets? What is a security asset? In other words, a firewall, a antivirus, your patching software, your SIM, and having those procedures. All of this will actually help you in the assessment. The clearer you are on where everything is and how articulate you could be describing it to people, the quicker your assessment will go. We also encourage everyone to do a mock or a readiness first. We are actually requiring everybody to do a readiness assessment as part of our package. We do not want to get to a point where someone budgeted and blown a ton of money and they misidentified or misunderstood something. We want to make this an open book test. That's what we're really aiming for. We want you to pass. Dustin asked in the chat, how much would you budget for planning, both actual assessment and reassessment? We have started seeing numbers coming in for assessments in the $50,000 to $125,000 range, all over the map. We're very much at the lower end of that. And we've just had a few clients that we're doing consulting for have gone out to get proposals, and they're coming out. What was coming in at 30 to 80 has shifted up to 50 to 100, depending on how many locations you have. Is your data on site or is it cloud-based? Do I have to visit one site, multiple sites? Are there multiple business units? So it's actually multiple assessments we have to do. There's a lot that kind of goes into it. And it's just time and people. These are not some cheap people that I have to bring to an assessment. And we're looking at probably a couple of weeks of work between prep, reading all the policies, reading the plans, the procedures, and then being on site for 3 or 4 days and then writing up a report. So we're budgeting 2 weeks of 2 people's time. So don't forget, when you're documenting your scope, your people are also CUI assets. So the people that can access that need to be documented. And what I see people doing, and this is fine, is saying, hey, I'm not putting it here in this document. Please refer to the Azure group called CUI people. And that group is reviewed weekly, monthly, quarterly. It's on a regular basis. These people are approved. And then there's actually a statement of the policy that says the people in the Azure group called CUI are authorized users and viewers of CUI. And that's all you need to do. Just a reminder, we've talked about this before, but this probably most of the people in this conversation, subcontractors, it flows down. If you are getting CUI that has been passed on to a prime, the prime is required to pass on the same level that they got. If the prime gets a self-assessment, they will pass on the self-assessment. Whatever the prime gets passed along. And what we're really hoping more and more people do is start limiting what they're sending, that they're not sending CUI down to their subcontractors. The other thing that's clearly back in play that I hope will help this is VDIs. They were already in play, but this is the idea of having remote desktops, virtual desktops, where the prime will host remote desktops that you will remote access into from your computer. You can't print, you can't copy paste, you're not allowed to bring anything down to your computer. In other words, that endpoint that you're using is defined in the rule as being out of scope. As long as those other controls are in place, this is a way to help share things with subcontractors without actually giving them the information. So this is an important thing to think about too. And of course, if you are a prime, you need to start keeping track of who you're sharing CUI with, or FCI, it could be that. Can a prime require a CMMC certification if their contract doesn't require a certification? This from Tom. To my understanding, no. They may require you to attest or put something in there. Prime's going to do what a prime wants to do, but as the rule is written, the prime who's getting a self-attestation requirement should be just passing on the self-attestation to you. If they pass on the full assessment to you and you know that the contract doesn't say that, please talk to your contract managing officer up there. Last couple slides I have, guys, are just a reminder of our tool we have out there. Thanks for the moment just to talk about ourselves for just a second. We do have a readiness tool out there. We do take people through this. It's online if you want to view it. Most people want to talk to us and go through the assessment. We actually take you through all the domains. We throw up your NIST store. We track tasks for you. The biggest thing we do is we translate all of these into plain English questions. There's a bunch of these out there. Practice, objective, yes, no. We don't do that. We actually just say, what are we going to ask you during an assessment when we do this? We go through all those pieces. Then we also using this again for the readiness. We are going to start allowing people to upload assessment information to this, and we're actually going to be using this for the assessment. There'll be a back end where we're going to start using for our assessments and be able to pump things right up to the EMAS system that'll do that. John, can requirements be challenged, for example, a number of level 3 requirements? So it's back to the contract and those negotiations. So if you're directly talking to your PMO and you're a prime, you may be able to challenge back, say, why are you requiring all 24 here? I expect officers just to say all 24. I don't want to try and pick and choose. Absolutely, as part of the negotiations, you should be able to go back and ask why for all of this. What are you asking for? If you're a subcontractor and you know the contract only has 10 of them and the prime is passing down all 24 to you, go back to them and ask why. We should find out what's going on that. I did it less than 30 minutes, guys. I know I did record this, so I'll be able to share this with other people. And I did talk fast intentionally because I didn't want to spend too much time on everybody's Friday afternoon. Say the last thing we're really waiting to hear about is the Rule 48 drop. What is that timing going to be? Any other questions, everyone? And of course, I'm going to put my email. I think it's on here on the chat. Grab my email. That's my office phone number. John always knows how to get a hold of me. If you have any other questions, please reach out to me and I'll do my best to answer them. Thank you all, guys, for attending this quickly set up webinar.